Arletta. Ms. Shea, in your testimony, you indicate that the VA has not provided Congress with information that backs up their conclusion that its choice to have leasing to lease these facilities, which is more expensive than construction, is justified. What metrics do you think would be helpful for the VA to consider, ma'am, convincingly to make their case to Congress that leasing provides the flexibility that they repeatedly claim?
Well, what we looked at in our report was the process that VA goes through to decide. We looked at 51 leases and the process they used to look to see whether leasing was the right approach. And in all 51 of those leases that we reviewed, they indicated that they required the flexibility to move. And sometimes this could even be when the choice to lease was more than the choice to own or construct. This goes back to one of the reasons we made the recommendation that VA does need to provide information, to start collecting information on how it has used these flexibilities. For example, the requirement that the leasing has for the VA to vacate after 20 years, are they, when they need to find a new lease space, are they still leasing in the same area? Or are they really having to move because the patient demographic has changed? Or are the seismic, security, and other standards really not that different from when they took over the lease, or do they really need to move? So there are a lot of things that on its face seem like the flexibility is useful for VA, but they aren't collecting any of the information to demonstrate how it has used that flexibility. Did they move? Did the patient demographic change? Did the seismic and federal security standards change? Did they record that? Did they then show how they benefited from that flexibility and that they need that moving forward? And so we made that recommendation to VA, and they have agreed to do that and include that information in its prospectuses going forward.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, what are the cost controls as the VA puts together a program of requirements for a lease facility? Do costs ever cause the VA to not lease or build a clinic because it's simply too expensive?
When we develop a business case, VA develops a rigorous business case for each of its lease actions. And in that, the business cases flow up from the clinicians in the field who actually are delivering care to the veterans. And we look at them to first look at whether they need a capital asset in the first place. They look at other alternatives before they look at leasing to see if that is more cost-effective or more appropriate to do. And then they look at build and they look at lease. In terms of the cost analysis, we look at what the industry standards are. We look at what indices they're showing of what leases should cost, adjusting them for some of the federal standards to ensure that we're submitting reasonable costs to the Congress when we submit these proposals. And then when our contracting folks execute it, they have to ensure that the cost, the rental rates we're paying for these leases are reasonable. But one thing I would say on costs,
sure.
Mr. Carson, is when you look at the real estate cost of providing care to veterans, we did a little analysis a few weeks ago and looked at what we see in the life cycle of a lease. When you look at a lease, when you're providing care for veterans, the real estate costs of a lease are less than 9 or 10% of what the cost it is to provide care for veterans. So when you really look at it, the real cost of deciding to put a clinic in, it's the docs, it's the nurses, it's the schedulers, it's all of those people that are there. And the real estate costs are really the small amount. So when we look at the consideration, we've always put with the question by people, you know, you could have a real estate solution that is 25 miles down the road that is $3 cheaper a square foot. But if the veterans and where they are and where they live are 25 miles away, our alternative has always been to put the clinic where the veterans are or closer to them, even if there is a cost difference. We look at, in the life of the lease, it's more important to provide the right services where the veterans are rather than to get, say, a primo real estate deal 45 miles away. And we've had that where people have come in and said, hey, we could save you $10 a square foot if you move 60 miles down the road. I guess you could, but the people wouldn't have as access to it. The same thing in some metropolitan areas. People are saying, well, if you can move one, you know, the other side of New York City, I could get you $3 off. Well, but if the veterans are in Manhattan and you're going to put it all the way out in Queens, you know, that for people in that area, that's a 2-hour commute difference. That's a huge impact on veterans. So we look at the cost that way as well. Thank you.
Well, now that we're out of time, thank you for the very deep explanation. Sorry, Mr. Weisner won't get to you, but nice haircut, my kind of guy. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.